The night shift doctor, extended English script, 15 minutes. He mopped the hospital corridors during the night shift. Same routine for 20 years. Nobody talked to him. Nobody even knew his name. But that night, when the ICU alarm went off and a young doctor screamed in panic, "Does anyone know this procedure?" The janitor took off his gloves and said, "I do." Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we tell this forgotten master's story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. 23 years ago, Dr. Robert Chen stood at the pinnacle of cardiac surgery. At 42, he was the youngest department head St. Mary's Hospital had ever appointed. His hands were steady, his mind sharp, his reputation flawless. Medical students competed to observe his surgeries. Colleagues sought his consultation on impossible cases. The medical journals called him the miracle worker. Insurance companies paid his fees without question. Patients flew in from across the country, desperate for his expertise. He performed 3, sometimes 4 surgeries a day, each one more complex than most surgeons attempted in a month, but success came with a price. Robert worked 16-hour days. He slept in his office more often than his own bed. His marriage had ended 2 years earlier. His ex-wife had said he loved the hospital more than her. She wasn't wrong. The night that changed everything started like any other. Robert had just finished a 6-hour valve replacement when his pager buzzed. Emergency surgery. A 34-year-old construction worker, father of 3, had fallen from scaffolding. Internal bleeding, collapsed lung, and most critically, his heart had been punctured by a broken rib. Robert scrubbed in for what would be his final operation. The patient, David Morrison, was unconscious on the table. His vital signs were failing fast. Robert had performed this exact procedure dozens of times before. He made the initial incision with his usual precision, but as he worked deeper, something felt different. His hands, those legendary steady hands, began to tremble. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight tremor as he reached for the sutures. Robert paused, took a deep breath, continued. But the trembling intensified. The OR team noticed. The nurses exchanged glances. The anesthesiologist looked up from his monitors with concern. Robert tried to compensate, slowing his movements, gripping the instruments tighter. But control was slipping away. As he attempted to repair the damaged heart muscle, his hand jerked unexpectedly. The needle punctured an artery. Blood flooded the surgical field. "Suction," Robert commanded, his voice steady even as his hands betrayed him. The team worked frantically to clear the blood, but more complications arose. The patient's blood pressure dropped dangerously. The heart monitor showed irregular rhythms. For 20 agonizing minutes, Robert fought to save David Morrison's life. But fatigue, stress, and whatever was causing his hands to shake had stripped away his surgical gift. At 3:47 a.m., the monitor flatlined. David Morrison died on Robert's table. The investigation that followed was thorough but inconclusive. No malpractice was found. The medical board determined that the patient's injuries were too severe for any surgeon to overcome. But Robert knew the truth. His trembling hands had sealed a man's fate. He thought about David's wife, Maria, who had waited in the family room, clutching their children's photos. He had to walk out and tell her that her husband, the father of their 3 young kids, wasn't coming home. "We did everything we could," Robert had said, the standard phrase every surgeon learns. But it felt like a lie. He hadn't done everything. He had failed when it mattered most. 2 weeks later, Robert submitted his resignation. He returned his medical license. He disappeared from a medical community entirely, leaving colleagues bewildered in medical journals to speculate about his sudden departure. What nobody knew was that Robert had developed essential tremor, a neurological condition that made fine motor control increasingly difficult. It was manageable, treatable even, but Robert couldn't bear the thought of another patient dying because his hands weren't steady enough. For 6 months, Robert drifted. He had savings, enough to live on for a while, but money wasn't his problem. Purpose was. For 20 years, saving lives had been his identity. Without surgery, without medicine, he didn't know who he was. That's when he saw the job posting at St. Mary's Hospital. Night shift janitor. No experience required. No questions asked. The irony wasn't lost on him. The hospital where he had once been revered as a miracle worker now needed someone to clean its floors. Robert applied under the name Bob Chen, listing no previous employment. The hiring manager, overwhelmed with applications and desperate for night shift coverage, barely glanced at his application. So began Robert's second life at St. Mary's. His first night back was surreal. Walking the same corridors where he had once strode confidently in surgical scrubs, he now pushed a mop cart through familiar territory made foreign. The cardiac wing, where his office had been, was now just another area to clean. The night shift staff was small. A skeleton crew of nurses, 1 or 2 resident doctors, security guards, and maintenance workers like him. Nobody recognized the former department head and the quiet janitor who arrived precisely at 11 p.m. each night. Robert established a routine. He would start in the emergency department, methodically cleaning each room, each corridor, then up to the ICU, where the most critical patients fought for their lives. Finally, he would clean the operating theaters, the place where he had once felt most alive. Those first months were torture. Every night, he witnessed the medical profession he had abandoned. He saw young doctors making decisions he could have made better. He watched procedures being performed with less skill than he possessed, even with his tremor. But he said nothing, did nothing. He just cleaned. The other janitors on his shift were kind but kept to themselves. There was Maria Santos, a grandmother from El Salvador who cleaned the pediatric ward and always had photos of her grandchildren. There was James Wright, a former factory worker who took the job after his plant closed and who knew more about hospital maintenance than the official engineers. They accepted Bob without question. He was quiet but reliable. He never missed a shift, never complained about assignments, and had an odd habit of volunteering to clean the most difficult areas, the places other janitors avoided. Blood didn't bother him. Neither did the sounds of medical equipment or the constant stream of emergencies. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived at St. Mary's on a cold Tuesday in November, 3 years into Robert's janitor career. She was 29, fresh from a competitive emergency medicine residency in Boston, and eager to prove herself. Sarah had specifically requested assignment to St. Mary's because of its reputation for handling complex trauma cases. What she found was an understaffed emergency department struggling with budget cuts and an increasing patient load. The other ER doctors were competent but overworked. The nurses were exceptional but stretched thin. And there was always that quiet janitor who seemed to appear whenever the department was busiest, cleaning around the chaos without ever getting in the way. Sarah first noticed Robert during her second week. She had been treating a homeless man who had collapsed outside the hospital. As she worked to stabilize him, she became aware that the janitor was cleaning nearby, moving with unusual awareness of the medical situation unfolding. Most cleaning staff would either avoid the area entirely or clean with obvious discomfort at the medical drama. This man seemed to anticipate where the team would move next, positioning himself to stay out of the way without interrupting his work. It was a small thing, but it caught Sarah's attention. Over the following months, Sarah began to notice other details about the night janitor. He never seemed startled by medical emergencies, never appeared squeamish around blood or trauma. When code blue alarms sounded, summoning all available medical staff to a cardiac emergency, he would quietly move his equipment out of the way with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what was happening. There was also his cleaning patterns. Sarah realized that Bob always cleaned the trauma rooms more thoroughly than other areas, paying particular attention to surgical instruments and monitoring equipment. It was as if he understood the critical importance of sterile environments in ways that other janitors didn't. But what struck Sarah most was his hands. Despite his age, which he estimated to be in his early 60s, his hands appeared skilled, careful. When he cleaned delicate medical equipment, he handled it with the reverence of someone who understood its purpose and value. 6 months after Sarah's arrival, everything changed with one patient. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Friday when the ambulance arrived. The paramedics wheeled in Maria Rodriguez, a 42-year-old restaurant manager who had collapsed during a shift. Initial assessment showed cardiac arrest, but this wasn't a typical heart attack. The EKG readings were erratic, suggesting a complex arrhythmia that had caused the heart to stop pumping effectively. Sarah immediately began standard resuscitation protocols: CPR, defibrillation, emergency medications. But Maria's heart refused to respond. The monitor showed occasional blips of electrical activity, but no coordinated pumping. She was essentially dead, kept alive only by the CPR being performed by Sarah's team. After 20 minutes of aggressive treatment, Sarah faced the terrible reality that she was losing the patient. She had exhausted the standard protocols. Maria needed a procedure that Sarah had only read about in textbooks, something called manual cardiac massage, where the surgeon opens the chest and physically massages the heart with their hands. It was an old technique, rarely used in modern medicine because it required surgical skills that most emergency doctors didn't possess. The cardiac surgeon on call was in another hospital, performing an emergency procedure. Even if he left immediately, he couldn't arrive in time. Does anyone know manual cardiac massage? Sarah called out desperately to the room. The old technique, direct heart massage. The nurses looked at each other helplessly. This wasn't something they taught anymore. The resident doctor shook his head. Modern medicine had machines for everything, but sometimes you needed human hands and old-school knowledge. That's when Robert stepped forward from the corner where he had been quietly cleaning. "I know how to do it," he said simply. Everyone in the room turned to look at the janitor. Sarah's first instinct was to dismiss him, but something in his voice, his certainty, made her pause. "Are you sure?" she asked. Robert nodded. "I've done it before, many times." Sarah faced an impossible choice. Let Maria die following proper protocol, or trust a janitor who claimed to know a complex surgical procedure. With the patient already clinically dead, she had nothing to lose. "Show me," she said. Robert moved to the sink and began scrubbing his hands with the thoroughness of a surgeon preparing for operation. Sarah watched in amazement as he performed the ritual she had seen hundreds of times in medical school, but never from a maintenance worker. "I need a surgical tray," Robert said. "Scalpel, retractors, and sutures for closure." Sarah's hands moved automatically, gathering the requested instruments. Robert's calm competence was reassuring. Even though nothing about this situation made sense, Robert approached Maria's still form on the gurney. He palpated her chest, locating anatomical landmarks with the precision of someone who had performed this examination countless times. Then he looked up at Sarah. "Are you ready to learn?" he asked. For the next 45 minutes, Robert performed surgery. Not a janitor pretending to be a doctor, but a master surgeon demonstrating his craft. He made a precise incision between Maria's ribs, inserted retractors to spread the opening, and then, with steady hands, began to massage her heart directly. Sarah watched in fascination as Robert's fingers worked with delicate strength, coaxing the cardiac muscle back to life. He explained each step as he worked, teaching her the technique with the patience of an experienced instructor. "The key is rhythm and pressure," he said as his hands worked. "Too gentle, and you don't perfuse the organs. Too aggressive, and you damage the muscle. Feel for the natural elasticity of the heart wall." Gradually, incredibly, Maria's heart began to respond. First, irregular flutters, then coordinated contractions. Finally, a strong, steady rhythm that appeared on the monitor. Robert continued the massage for another 10 minutes, ensuring the heart could sustain its rhythm independently. Then he stepped back and began closing the incision with the skill of a master surgeon. "She'll need to go to cardiac ICU immediately," he told Sarah. "Monitor for rhythm disturbances and watch for signs of surgical site infection. The heart muscle may be fragile for the next 24 hours." As the team prepared Maria for transfer to intensive care, Sarah stayed at Robert in confusion and growing suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked. Robert was cleaning his hands again, methodically removing all traces of the procedure. "I'm Bob," he said. "I clean the hospital." "That's not what I mean, and you know it. Nobody learns surgery from watching TV. You just performed a procedure that most cardiac surgeons haven't done in 20 years. Robert dried his hands and reached for his mop. "Sometimes you pick things up," he said. Sarah wasn't satisfied with that answer, but before she could press further, Robert had disappeared into the maze of hospital corridors, leaving behind only the lingering mystery of a janitor who operated like a surgeon. The next day, Sarah couldn't concentrate on her work. She kept thinking about the previous night's events. A maintenance worker had performed complex cardiac surgery with skills that surpassed her own and most of the doctors she knew. It was impossible unless... That evening, Sarah went to the hospital's administrative offices. She needed to know more about Bob Chen. His employment file was thin, almost suspiciously so. No previous work history, no references. No background information beyond a name and address. Frustrated but determined, Sarah turned to the hospital's medical archives. If Bob had learned surgery somewhere, there might be records. She started with a simple search for Robert Chen in the medical staff directories going back 20 years. What she found changed everything. Dr. Robert Chen, Chief of Cardiac Surgery, 1995 to 2003. One of the hospital's most distinguished physicians. Pioneering techniques in valve repair. Published extensively in cardiac journals. And then, suddenly, nothing. His name simply disappeared from hospital records after 2003. Sarah stared at the computer screen in disbelief. The quiet janitor who mopped floors every night was Dr. Robert Chen, former head of cardiac surgery. But why was he cleaning hospitals instead of performing surgery? She dug deeper into the archives and found the answer in a brief administrative note from 2003. Dr. Chen had submitted his resignation effective immediately, citing personal reasons. No details, no explanation, just the abrupt end of a brilliant career. The next night, Sarah waited for Robert to begin his shift. She found him in the cardiac wing, methodically cleaning the same operating theaters where he had once performed miracles. Dr. Chen, she said quietly. Robert stopped mopping but didn't turn around. I know who you are, Sarah continued. I looked you up. You were chief of cardiac surgery. Why are you here, cleaning floors? Robert finally turned to face her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he began to tell her the story he had never shared with anyone. He told her about David Morrison, the construction worker who died on his table, about the tremor that had developed in his hands, about the guilt that had driven him from medicine, about the 20 years he had spent trying to atone for one night when his hands had failed him. I couldn't save him, Robert said. My hand shook, and he died because of it. I couldn't risk that happening again. Sarah listened without judgment as Robert described his exile from medicine, his need to stay connected to the hospital environment, his hope that someday he might find a way to make amends. But your hand was steady last night, Sarah observed. You saved Maria's life with skills I've never seen. Robert looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly. The tremor comes and goes. Stress makes it worse. But when someone's life is at stake, when I'm focused completely on helping, sometimes the tremor disappears. Sarah understood. Robert's guilt had driven him from surgery, but his skill and knowledge remained. He had been cleaning around medicine for 20 years, waiting for a moment when he could practice it again. You could come back, Sarah said. The hospital needs surgeons like you. Robert shook his head. I'm too old. My hands aren't reliable. Last night was an exception. Then teach, Sarah suggested. Your knowledge shouldn't die with you. Train the next generation of surgeons. Robert considered this. For 20 years, he had thought only about his failure, his guilt, his inability to continue operating. He had never considered that his knowledge might still have value, even if his hands could no longer be trusted with a scalpel. I don't know if they'd let me, he said. Let me find out, Sarah replied. The conversation that followed between Sarah and the hospital administration was delicate and complex. Robert's sudden departure from medicine 20 years earlier had left questions, but his reputation before that departure was impeccable. More importantly, the hospital faced a shortage of experienced cardiac surgeons and could benefit from his knowledge. A month later, Dr. Robert Chen returned to medicine as a consultant and instructor. He didn't perform surgery, but he taught young doctors the techniques and procedures he had mastered over decades of practice. The tremor in his hands made him unsuitable for operations, but it didn't affect his ability to demonstrate procedures on training models or guide other surgeons through complex cases. Maria Rodriguez recovered completely from a cardiac episode. She never knew that the man who saved her life had been mopping floors an hour before performing a surgery. To her, he was simply the skilled doctor who had given her a second chance. Sarah remained in the emergency department, but she often attended Robert's teaching sessions. She had witnessed something extraordinary that night. The transformation of a janitor back into a surgeon, and she wanted to understand everything she could about cardiac procedures. Robert never spoke publicly about his years as a janitor. When asked about his absence from medicine, he would only say that he had needed time to reflect on his practice. But privately, he remained grateful for those 20 years of cleaning floors and watching medicine from the outside that he had learned humility in those corridors, learned that healing happened at every level of the hospital, from the surgeons who operated to the janitors who maintained clean, safe environments for recovery. He had also learned that redemption wasn't always about returning to what you used to be, but sometimes about finding new ways to serve. Dr. Robert Chen taught cardiac surgery for another 15 years before finally retiring at age 78. His students went on to save thousands of lives using techniques he had developed and refined over his career. But he never forgot the lesson of that night, when Sarah had trusted a janitor to perform surgery. Sometimes the most important knowledge comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes redemption arrives not when we are ready for it, but when someone else needs us to be ready. And sometimes, the person mopping the floor next to you is more to teach than anyone in the room realizes. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Robert? Someone who carried their past silently, who never asked for recognition, but who was ready to help when needed. Write their name in the comments, share their story. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe the most powerful stories don't shout, they wait. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, subscribe, share, and help us keep these voices alive. We'll see you in the next one.